The Last of Us Part 2 is a controversial game to say the very least. Nearly every criticism imaginable has been levied against it. People were disappointed with its story direction and its character choices. Some claimed it disrespected the first game, it was a bad sequel, or it was just simply a bad game. Whether your opinions of The Last of Us Part 2 was positive or negative, you can't deny it made waves in the gaming landscape. Personally speaking, I absolutely love the game. Despite the fact that there are some narrative and pacing choices I don't agree with, it didn't take away from my overall enjoyment of it, and it is hands down one of my favorite games of all time. After my recent replay of The Last of Us Part 2, I was left with a thought. Why do I love this game so much? Why does the story work for me, yet not for so many other people? With that question in mind, I decided to dissect the narrative of The Last of Us Part 2 and go through everything in order to truly understand why I love the story so much. I'm putting personal feelings aside and looking at this game truly, objectively, through a hypercritical lens. While I would typically go into a brief narrative recap of the story, The Last of Us Part 2 is very long, and every attempt I've made at a brief narrative recap, the video has come out to be about 30 minutes in length. In order to keep it brief, I'm just going to assume you already know the story. For those of you who haven't played the story, here's a brief unscripted narrative recap. Joel kills Abby's father, Abby kills Joel, Ellie gets sad and tracks Abby down to Seattle, Ellie kills a bunch of Abby's friends, and then goes back home to the theater, and then Abby tracks her down, is about to kill her, then cut to black, and then you're playing as Abby, and then Abby's looking for her ex-boyfriend because he went missing, finds some kids, goes and finds the boyfriend. Turns out the ex-boyfriend, wants to go leave for Santa Barbara, and Abby can't stop thinking about the kids, so she goes to save the kids, takes them back to the ex-boyfriend, only saves, I guess, a kid and a half, and then one of the kids wants to go find their mom, so he runs away, and then Abby goes after the kid and then only saves one of the kids because one dies as there's a big war going on. They return back to the place, and then the ex-boyfriend's dead, and Abby gets sad, tracks Ellie down, tries to kill Ellie, but then stops and then lets her live. Then goes to Santa Barbara. Ellie goes home but can't move on from the pain and torture of the PTSD-riddled mind she has. Then finds out that Abby's in Santa Barbara. Then she's like, okay, I know I have a good life, but f*** it, I'm going to go find this person. So she goes to Santa Barbara, tracks down Abby, then is about to kill her, and then stops because she realizes that maybe I can forgive her because I learned to forgive Joel. And then goes back home and finds out the life she had is now over because everybody she loved has left her because she chose revenge over love, and now she's sad. The end. Look, the story's a lot better than I just said. If you haven't played it, just go play the game or watch someone play it. Something like that. Yeah. Anyway, on to the analysis. The Last of Us Part 2 is a very complex story, to say the least. You have a story about pain, loss, and atonement with multiple greatly flawed characters who inhabit a deeply flawed world. There truly aren't any good people in this world. Everyone, and I mean everyone, has done something horrible to survive. I'm reminded of the Lloyd Alexander quote, thus death begets death, evil begets evil. The Last of Us Part 2 is a cyclical story about an eye for an eye. Joel kills Abby's father. Abby kills Ellie's father. Ellie kills Abby's friends, Abby kills Ellie's friends, and so on and so forth. Death begets death, begets death, begets death. Despite popular opinion stating otherwise, I don't believe the theme of the story is about the negatives of revenge. Obviously, it's a main focal point of the story, with both main characters' sole motivations being driven by the need for revenge. However, if you really break down the story of The Last of Us Part 2, I believe the story is actually about forgiveness. The revenge Ellie is seeking all throughout the story is simply a coping mechanism. She is so grief-stricken by Joel's death but doesn't want to confront her emotions, so she hides behind the metaphorical drug that is revenge. Revenge is constantly fueling her. It's her justification for all the horrendous things she's done throughout the story. Why stop to think about the scores of wolves and scars she murdered or the nearly 900 miles she traveled just to get one person when she can solely focus on the anger that which drives her? Revenge blinds. That's what she wants. She doesn't want to face herself, so she blinds herself. This is further reiterated upon at the end of the game in Santa Barbara. Ellie, once again, chooses revenge and leaves her perfect life behind to travel over 1,000 miles for one person. It is at the end when she finally sees Abbey and Lev tied to the post, broken, emaciated, barely clinging to life, that she begins to have second thoughts. Ellie realizes that Abbey has endured so much more pain and suffering than she was ever going to inflict on her, and that Abbey is merely a shell of her former self. It's here Ellie decides that killing Abbey now would be pointless. However, as they're about to leave, Ellie's brain snaps back to Joel and she's reminded of the pain again, and, once again, lapses back to the revenge drug. They fight and Ellie comes out on top this time, and when she's seconds away from killing Abbey, she flashes back to Joel on his porch. Their last conversation. Why this is so important is because it was here that Ellie finally confronted Joel about their issues. That she was upset with Joel because she wanted her life to mean something, and Joel robbed her of that. But when asked, Joel told her that he would still do it all over again. It's here that Ellie tells him that despite all that, she'd like to try to forgive him. Yet Abbey robbed her of that. It wasn't just the torture and the murder of Joel that fueled Ellie's need for revenge. No, it was all because she couldn't make amends with him. Ellie metaphorically tortured Joel for years, which I'd imagine was far more painful for Joel than anything Abbey did or ever could do. When Joel tells her he would do it all over again, she finally realizes the love he feels for her, and she realizes that he is the father she always wanted. She hates herself for putting Joel through all that bullshit when all she needed to do was have a simple heart-to-heart with him. She just wasn't mature enough to realize that. So just when she thought she conquered that pain, Joel is killed and Ellie decides to lapse back to her old ways and avoid the pain of confrontation. That's the pain Ellie was avoiding for so long. That was the pain she didn't want to confront. In order to prolong this avoidance mentality, Ellie uses revenge as a means to hide her own feelings. Because feelings are hard. Why try to cope and work through them when you could just ignore it, right? Ellie is proof it never works, and by bottling everything up, it will, inevitably, eat you alive. So when Ellie gets that brief flashback of Joel as she's drowning Abbey, she's reminded of the forgiveness. If she can forgive Joel for what he did, then she could forgive the woman who killed him. In forgiving Abbey, Ellie not only is forgiving herself, but finally, after months and months of pain and suffering, comes to terms about what happened and moves on. When Ellie returns to her now abandoned house and leaves her guitar behind, that is symbolic of her finally forgiving herself, Joel and Abbey, and hopefully moving towards a better future. That is the true meaning of the story. However, the meaning is lost when you take into account the two biggest narrative hiccups that put a lot of people off from this story. These hiccups are what many, if not everyone, mentions as their least favorite parts of the story. Hiccup number one is Joel's death. People argue that it was completely out of character for Joel to willingly go with a bunch of strangers to an unknown location and trust them not to try anything. While that may have been true in the past, you need to consider a few factors. Joel's lackadaisical attitude is obviously very strange behavior when directly comparing Joel from Last of Us Part 1 and Joel from Last of Us Part 2. But you have to remember what he's been up to for the past 4 years. He's been in Jackson, living a relatively normal life with relatively normal people. While living in Boston, Joel was working a high-risk job as a smuggler and had to be ready for literally anything. Humans, infected, what have you. He couldn't trust anybody because no one could be trusted. Whereas in Jackson, it's the closest thing to the quote-unquote good old days he's experienced in the past 20-plus years. He's not a smuggler anymore. He's simply Joel Miller. He's gotten soft, let his guard down. Due to the happiness and hope he felt in Jackson, he allowed himself to regain hope in humanity, which, sadly, was his downfall. The second hiccup is during the Abbey-Ellie theater confrontation and the jarring shift to playing as Abbey. This is personally my biggest gripe with the game. Throughout the whole game, it's building, reach the climax, and cut to Abbey. And we start from scratch all over again. This absolutely kills the pacing and completely halts the story to a dead stop. I totally understand people's hate for this section, and I totally understand what Naughty Dog was attempting to do, but the way in which they did it was such a massive narrative whiplash that you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone who actually liked it. For instance, let me finally put my degree to use and show you a quick diagram of a Freytag triangle to illustrate to you all just what they did. For those of you who don't know what a Freytag triangle is, it's a diagram to show the 5 key stages of storytelling: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. The Last of Us Part 2 essentially did exposition. 4 years after the last game, Joel's actions catch up with him, resulting in his death at the hands of Abbey, the daughter of the doctor he killed. Rising action. Ellie tracks Abbey down to Seattle and systematically kills off her friends to get to her and make her pay. Climax. After 3 days of hunting, Ellie and Abbey finally have their confrontation, where exposition. After the death of Abby's father at the hands of Joel, she vows to find him one day and kill him for what he did to her. Rising action. After killing Joel and returning home to Seattle, Abby's ex is hunted after saving an enemy combatant. Along the way, Abbey finds 2 kids on the run and decides to help them, all the while a war in the background between the 2 major factions in Seattle comes to a head. Climax. Abbey is ready to leave Seattle with her new family only to find them murdered by Ellie. She then tracks Ellie down and the 2 finally have their confrontation, where Abbey almost kills Ellie, instead beating her nearly to death and leaving her for dead. Falling action. In the aftermath, Ellie and Dina have moved to a nice, secluded farmhouse, raising their newborn baby as Abbey and Lev head to Santa Barbara to find the last of the Fireflies. Rising action. Tommy tells Ellie that they've tracked Abbey to Santa Barbara. Ellie decides to finish things and goes after Abbey. Climax. Abbey and Ellie have a final fight, which results in Ellie letting Abbey live as she finally forgives not only Abbey, but herself. Falling action. Ellie forgives Abbey and returns home as Abbey and Lev find the Fireflies. Resolution. Ellie is alone, her biggest fear. After constantly pursuing Abbey in an attempt to avoid coming to terms with her emotions, in the end, she realizes that she needs to move on and grows from the experience at the detriment of those around her. So, as you all can see, it's a bit all over the place. We essentially have 2.5 climaxes, 2 falling actions, and 1 resolution. Again, I totally get what they were attempting to do by subverting expectations, but I think they could have done it in a much better way than they did. For the Joel hiccup, maybe have a little piece at the beginning that showcases just how different he is. Maybe have him playing some music for a small crowd, or actually show Esther, Joel's girlfriend, that they cut from the game. Just something that we would not expect to see from the Joel we knew from the first game. All it needs to be is very brief, but that little brief bit of exposition would go a long way. As for the Abbey issue, I would have wished her story would have tied in closer with Ellie's instead of being completely disconnected. Drop the whole Santa Barbara part and have that Abbey-Ellie fight plus Ellie's realization and forgiveness with the backdrop of the Scars and Wolves killing each other on Scar Island. But I digress. Instead of writing a whole new story, I feel like it would work better if the stories alternated from Ellie to Abbey, so they both reached the narrative climax at the same time. At the end of Ellie's Seattle Day 1, when Ellie is about to have the dinosaur flashback, have it be the Abbey flashback, and then pick up with Abbey in Seattle Day 1. Abby's mission finishes, and instead of the Yara Lev nightmare, it's Ellie's flashback to her dinosaur birthday, and so on and so forth. Pretty much alternate. Ellie missions end with an Abbey flashback, and then we proceed to play the Abbey mission. Abbey mission ends with an Ellie flashback, then we proceed to play the Ellie mission. That way, it wouldn't be so jarring and both character climaxes would be reached at the same time. I'm actually really curious to see if this would actually fix the pacing issues. Someone with way more time than me should really cut together an edit of the game in the way I just described and show someone the standard version and the edited version and see what they like better. Despite the little hiccups, I still believe The Last of Us Part 2 is a masterpiece. The story is beautiful and sad because at the end of the day, the genre of The Last of Us is a tragedy. The whole point of a tragedy is to showcase human suffering with the intention to invoke an accompanying catharsis in the audience. The Last of Us Part 2 does that expertly. After playing the game for the first time on release, I thought about it for weeks on end and had this strange cathartic melancholy feeling in my chest. Picking it up 2 years after release, I had the same exact feeling all over again. I knew exactly what happened, yet it still moved me and still gave me that cathartic melancholy feeling. That really is the goal of any artist, to move their audience and make them think about their work, minutes, hours, days, and weeks after they've seen it. The Last of Us Part 2 does that exceptionally well, and that, in my opinion, is the brilliance and beauty of The Last of Us.